Colossians chapter 3, 6 and 7 is where we'll start tonight, so read there with me, and this is where we finished off last week. Remember, verse 5 tells us that we have to be people who prepare ourselves. We have to remove fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And then this is what verses 6 and 7 read. For which things' sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience, and the time which ye also walked, or in the which ye also walked some time, when ye lived in them. I'm glad we're going to pick up here tonight, because it tells us, in essence, something that I believe we need to be reminded of from time to time. At one point in time, we used to walk in sin. I think that's a healthy reminder for us. We don't walk that way anymore. Or maybe we should say it this way, we shouldn't be walking in sin anymore. And that's the difference between living for the world and living for Christ. When you live for the world, you end up with verse 5, remember? You end up with a nation or a world who is concerned about fornication. You have a world that's concerned about uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil thoughts. And doesn't that describe the way our world lives? Doesn't that describe the way that those who are not Christians live in their lives? And verse 7, the reference is back to the 5 wicked practices inside of verse 5. The wrath of God has threatened in verse 6 on those that are guilty, and Paul reminds the Colossians that they had been guilty prior to their conversion. The same is true for you and me. At one time, we were guilty to sin. Now, it may not have been the 5 things or the things that are listed in verse 5, but at one point in time, we were guilty of sin. And thankfully, we can be children of God in our lives and live in this life. But there's something that happens inside of verse 7 I want us to see. When ye lived in them. What does that tell us about sin? What does that tell us about sin? I think it tells us sin's a choice, doesn't it? When you lived in them. Don't we choose every day how we live? Don't we choose the words that come out of our mouths? Don't we choose the actions that come from our lives? Don't we choose what comes into our lives and what goes out of our lives? I think it tells us living in sin's a choice. But number 2, I think it tells us that we don't have to live that way, doesn't it? That's right, it would be. It would be. And the same is true in our lives. If it would be true of God ignoring sin and approving sin, isn't it true for us? If we ignore sin in our lives, or maybe we ignore sin in the lives of those that are around us, isn't that approval?
It tells us that sin is always there before us.
That's a very good idea of this passage. It's always there before us. But I think it also tells us this: God is merciful, isn't He? God is merciful. God has provided a way for sin to be removed from our lives. If the scenes of the cross did not exist, what would we have? No hope, would we? We'd have no hope. Even if you look at the Old Testament was never designed to forgive sin, was it? Sins were yet perpetually rolled forward, as we would call it, as the Scripture calls it. But the cross is that which removes sin, and God is merciful. Mm-hmm. Sure did. Sure did. That's right. That's right. Can't live like the world and become a Christian, can you? Can you? No. To become a child of God, to become a Christian requires change. That's a good point. That tells us about God's mercifulness. As we enter into verse 8, we're going to learn that this particular section, all the way down to verse 11 of Colossians chapter 3, is going to teach us that we have to get these things out of our lives. And it's really impressive here. He's transitioning from what you used to be to how you've got to keep it out of your lives and how you got it out of your life in the first place. And he's going to list some more things for us that we need to pay attention to. Just read with me 8 through 9. But now ye also put off these, or put off all these, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communications out of your mouth. Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds. I think there's several things that are impressive in this verse. If I'm going to be a Christian, if I'm going to continue to be a Christian, I think that's the context of the passage. But now, as a child of God who's put off these sinful practices, there's still more to do. There's still more to learn. There's still more to work at. And isn't it impressive that he starts with anger? Has anybody in this room ever been angry? Let me ask it this way, and I'll keep my hands down. Has anyone ever not been angry? Anger. Anger was to be put away from these Christians. It's the same thing for us. And anger, in its very definition, is a strong feeling of displeasure over some action or word or situation. Lipscomb said anger is the natural passion or emotion of displeasure aroused by injury or insult, real or imagined, and directed against the cause thereof, sudden and strong displeasure. And Lipscomb says the apostle requires that this feeling be controlled. I found something interesting in what David Lipscomb wrote. Real or imagined. Have you ever imagined that someone did something to you and they didn't? Most of us. Nobody shook their head yes, but everybody smiled. Y'all can't see that from your perspective. Anger is an emotion. And every one of us is going to have to deal with it. And our anger here, he says, your anger must be in check. Scripture teaches us much about anger. Righteous anger? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Let's ask a question about what this anger is. Is God ever depicted as being angry? That's right. That's right. He drove them out. He did. That's right. Did God ever destroy 99.9% of this world? The flood. Righteous anger. Now let me ask you this question. Is God angry as we're angry? Is God angry as we're angry? Is he?
I think he's angry when he sees us doing so many stupid things that it's not righteous in his eyes, but we just do it anyway.
But is God angry? What happens when we're angry? Well, here's what we do. You hit me, what am I going to do? I hit you. That's how we possess anger. You say something mean to me, I'm going to say something worse. Is that God? Never. That's right. That's right. And I think that's exactly what he's telling us here. It's how you respond. Are terrible things possibly going to be said about us? Well, very possible. Are people ever going to be, and I'm just going to use elementary language, mean to us? Yep. How are we going to react? How are we going to react? We're going to be calm. We're going to sling words around. That's up to you and me. That's a very good thought. There's two ways to look at anger. Sometimes we only look at anger as displacing anger out, but what happens when we only internalize it and we hold on to that anger? Creates resentment, doesn't it? Now there's a passage I want you to think about, Ephesians 4:26. Be ye angry and sin not, let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil, verse 26 and 27 there. Anger's an emotion. And we have to keep it in check. I'm really impressed that he starts with anger, because every one of us deals with it, sometimes daily. Then he says this. Now, attached to anger is wrath. Attached to anger is wrath. Wrath here is to be put away. Notice the first line of verse 8. But now also put off all of these. Wrath has to be put out of our lives. Now, wrath is a deep, determined, and long-lasting anger. In other words, I'll let this fester, and I'll get you when you don't see it coming. That's right. No forgiveness, no mercy, no care, no grace in our lives. It's also defined, the word wrath is defined as uncontrolled passion, used in a negative sense. Uncontrolled passion. When anger flies off the hinges. Wrath. Wrath. He says, put it away. Now, attached to anger, attached to wrath is malice. Malice is to be put away. Malice is the feeling of ill will toward someone. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You just internally answer this to yourself. Have you ever seen someone and thought, I can't stand him? Malice. Malice. When you see something and rage rushes across your bones. You ever blood boiled when you've seen somebody? That's malice. You can't stand it. The feeling of ill will toward another. It's also defined as a desire for some evil to befall on someone else. Have you ever heard someone say this? I hope they get hurt. I hope they fall off that ladder. Anybody ever heard that? The giggles tell me, yeah. I'm not going to tell on them, but I sure hope they find out what he did. Malice. It's the opposite of love. Romans 13 verse 10 says, love worketh no evil. How can we be a loving people if we're hoping someone gets hurt or fired or worse, dead? What happens to Luke 6:31 with malice? As ye would that men should do unto you, do ye also to them likewise.
Isn't that eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth?
To a degree, yes. If you look in the Old Testament, there's many occasions of scenes of phrases like that. What does this have to do with capital punishment? Let's just dig into that hole for just a minute. A very short minute. How does this play in with the electric chair? That's right. Romans 13. Do we ever wish someone's death by the government? No. Sometimes we wish that people die. We sometimes wish that the law will be carried out, but I think there's a difference in wishing the law will be carried out and wishing somebody was dead. That's the point I'm trying to make to you. That's right. Are we making the judgment? What does it take to make a judgment? What do we think about that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. I agree. Oh, I agree. I'm not disagreeing with any one of you. But do we wish death upon anyone? Do we wish ill toward anyone? That's not saying we don't wish that their punishment comes true. Oh, yeah. But do we wish that people die and are lost? You got to think about that for a minute. And that's really hard to rationalize in the mind, isn't it? It's hard to separate, and that's the part of the discussion that's hard. That's right. That's right. People that are sentenced to death, most likely, if that sentence comes true, they're going to die. That's right. That's right. Well, here's what you're asking. Is capital punishment allowed? Yes. But we should never wish that someone dies. That's my point here. The atrocity may be great, but consider the aspect of the soul. To a degree, yes. To a degree, yes. Only you. Well, you said it. I didn't. But just contemplate this a minute. Do we wish that someone dies? Are we ever going to be at war again? Aren't we dropping bombs right now?
We may make a statement that that person deserves the capital punishment.
Yes.
But as far as wishing that is carried out,
And I stand before you saying there's a difference in those statements. That's what I'm trying to tell you. There's a difference in punishment and wishing someone to die. That's malice.
Isn't that the same sequence of when both sides go to war? What are we doing? Everybody's bullets are flying both directions. Everybody's mass murdering everybody else.
It's a very interesting discussion, isn't it? We do. I think we're going to be responsible for everything we do, say, and think. That's what the Word teaches us, isn't it? The Word knows the thoughts and intents of the heart, doesn't it? Are we responsible for our thoughts and intents of our heart? That gets on to us, doesn't it? But what's impressive to me here, he says, and he's writing this to Christians, you've got to keep getting better. You've got to keep working. You've got to keep pushing to the goal, because at the end of the day, all of these things, anger, wrath, and malice, these three things he starts with, have to do with life. The first murder on this earth, what was it a result of? He was angry, jealousy, wrath, malice. Then there's this interesting word, blasphemy. Blasphemy. Now the question is, where is he directing this? And I think the context of verses 8 and 9, and when you add verse 10 into this, tells us the idea that this is talking about one to another. Blasphemy is to be put away. Blasphemy, to speak against another. To speak against another. Lipscomb says it's scornful, divisive language, and to blame with bitterness. And it can be directed at God or man.
Jonathan, the Greek word there means to injure by speech.
Yes. Yes. To injure. Isn't that interesting?
Got a note in my Bible I wrote on that word blasphemy. It is to speak evil against someone, some other person with intent to create harm.
That's right.
With intent.
That's right. It has to do with intent. You're all the way right. What does blasphemy lead to? Anger, wrath, and malice. Then he says this, filthy communication. It has to be shunned, it has to be put out of its life. The American Standard Version translates it a little bit better, and I think it's best when it translates it there, and it says it's shameful speaking. Shameful speaking has to be put out of our lives. Obscene and filthy talk.
I don't think one human on the entire planet, in all these thousands of years, hasn't used at least a couple of cuss words.
And I don't think the context of this passage is saying anything different than that either, but he says you got to quit doing it. That's the point of this section. It's not about the past per se. It's about whether a Christian can be someone who's angry enough to have wrath and malice. It's asking the question, can a Christian live and try to injure a fellow Christian? Can a Christian live and spew out foul things in his life? And I believe the context of this says this is not true. A Christian cannot live that way. A Christian cannot, in this particular section, live this way. Now notice verse 9. Lie not one to another. That's why I think we can say that the blasphemy and filthy communications is talking about one to another. The context of this is very personal, and it's Christian to Christian. Lie not one to another. Well, what about? Well, here's the reality. Lying is always sinful. Lying is always sinful. But you think about two Christians lying to one another. Oh my. Ephesians 4:25 says, putting away lying. Revelation 21:8 says that liars have a place reserved for them. Lying, whether we see it as something very small, which I think many times we've convinced ourselves, oh, it's just a little, what's that thing, a little, well, y'all know about that too? We've convinced ourselves that, oh, it is, I mean no, but I'm going to say yes. It's easier if I just say yes when I mean no. I don't answer those kind of questions. But you think about that for a minute. That's a good one. I don't answer questions like that. No, I don't.
In wishful fantasy, if the human population just stay away from everybody, a lot of that stuff wouldn't even cross my mind, would it?
We'd still do it, wouldn't we? If we didn't work at it. That's the point of this section. You've got to work it. You've got to put these things off. You've got to work every day at this. And that's what this section's talking about. No, he's not. Interesting, when Jesus was tempted, in Matthew 4:1-11, the devil left him for a season. You'll read at the end of that. Just for a season. He may not be tempting you now, but it's just like the Tennessee weather. You give it time and that'll change. That's right. That's right. But the reason assigned for shunning lying and the other sinful practices above is the fact that the old man of sin has been put off. We're not a people of anger anymore. We're not a people who are filled with wrath, looking for the injury of others. We're not a people of malice who wish ill will toward anyone. We're not a people who use our words to destroy reputations.
James talks about that when he says, can a fountain, spring, bitter water?
Sweet water. Can it? You go home, turn your water on. You expect salt water out of that? You expect pure water, don't you? Fresh water, clean water. What about your mouth? What about your life? Can a Christian live in anger and everybody know it? Or everybody not know it? It's interesting to me that anger, wrath, and malice can all be done behind closed doors.
Doesn't Satan have a part in this too?
He does, but here's the deal with Satan. If we let him in the door, he'll come in the house. Remember Jesus in Matthew 4? It is written, it is written, it is written. You know how to keep devil out of your house? Bring God in it. Satan has something to do with this? Why, yes, he does. But it also has to do that the old man, the ending of verse 9, the old man has been put off. And verse 10, it gives us the key to this. And have put on the new man, now notice this, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. Go down to verse 11 with me. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. This is the second reason that lying and the other sins mentioned here must be put away from us. We're a new man. We're a new creature. We're different. I'm glad Joe mentioned earlier repentance. We've changed. Good definition of a Christian is one who has changed his life. It's not enough to just put off sinful practices, because if you just put them off, what are you going to do? You're going to have a void, aren't you? Here's the idea here. We put off these sinful practices to put on godly practices. To put on godly practices. We must replace the evil with good. Same thing found in Ephesians 4:24. We replace these sinful practices with things that Christians should have, and that's passages like 2 Peter 1:5-7, which reads, "And besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love." We put off anger, and we replace it with joy. Why can we replace anger with joy? Because we're redeemed. We put off in our lives wrath, and we add to our life grace, don't we?
Let's not forget, the Bible also says, turn the other cheek.
We put off in our lives malice, and we look at the Great Commission. Not evil-willed, good-willed. We put off blasphemies, and we learn that iron sharpens iron. And we put off filthy communications in our lives, and we learn to speak the gospel. That's the difference. Where there was anger, there can be no more anger. Where there was foul language, there can be no more of that. You know, foul language can be more than just certain words, can it? It can be a joke, it can be a story, it can be an account, it can be all host of things. But I replaced that with good things. And I find it impressive here. He says we do this by obtaining the knowledge that's found inside of the Scriptures, or inside of the image of Christ. Hoping to preach a sermon soon entitled Follow Christ. And the whole premise of the sermon is, when we look at Christianity, are we only looking at it to get people in the water? Or are we looking at the Great Commission with the idea of turning people over to the Lord? I think there's a difference in those two statements. Are we looking at bringing and putting about people who become Christians, or are we looking at people who just are shallow soil? It has to do with our outlook. And then verse 11 here. Yes. Yes, it does. Spiritual growth. That's a good point to be made. And I think we've made this, I've said this recently, but do you only work out 1 hour a week? Do you only eat, I think maybe we said this last week in class, would you only eat 1 meal a week? I think we specifically made the reference, would we feed a baby just 1 bottle a week? I think that was it. What about your life? You struggling with anger? It's time to grow, Christian. There's something I think we should notice also with verse 10. This could be a struggle for us. This could be a struggle for us. Very well could. And then verse 11, I think it wraps it all up in a nice little package. Well, who can do this? You ever heard somebody say, I can't become a Christian? I just can't live like that? I think verse 11 here dispels that. Anybody can become a child of God if they're willing to take advantage of Christ.
Paul killed Christians. Have you done anything worse than that?
That's a very good question. That is. The whole point of this section is if you put off sin.
It has to be a transformation
That's right.
instead of conforming back to what you were.
That's right. That's Romans 12, 1 and 2. Have to be converted, have to be transformed. Now, he's going to transition here in verse 12 and give us some ideas of things as we move into this particular section. Give us some ideas. Well, what can I put in the place of anger? What can I put in the place of wrath and malice and evil communications and blasphemies against my brethren? What good things can I put in my life? This is verse 12 and 13. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do you, or do ye. Before one can, now hear me what I'm getting ready to say. Before one can be properly dressed, he must take off the clothes that he has on. Before one can be properly dressed, he must take off the clothes that he has on. Same thing is true in our lives. As we become Christians, we must put off the clothing of sin. We must put off the lifestyle of sin. And here in this particular section, verse 12, the word put. It's interesting to me that this is a word that doesn't just mean I'm going to do it once, but I'm going to keep on doing it as I live my life marching toward heaven. I'm going to put it on continually. It denotes action. It denotes time space. It's going to be something I continually do in my life. Now, having consulted what's already been talked about here, and having written to them that they had to put these things off, here he begins this section telling them what they need to put on. But I want you to know something before he gets to that. Put on, therefore, as the elect of God. What does that mean? The elect of God. The saints. Put on, therefore, as the holy ones. The ones that are set apart for God's service. Put on, therefore, as Christians. Now notice what he says next. Holy and beloved. God loves His creation enough that He calls His people holy and beloved. That's important to note. You may feel like no one loves you, but the Lord loves you. And He tells you you've got to keep living the Christian life. He says here you've got to put on bowels of mercy. This is equal to saying have a heart of compassion. Have a heart of compassion. In other words, here's what bowels of mercy says. Walk in their shoes. Walk in their shoes. Why does he start with bowels of mercy? And just as we ask that question, why did he start with anger in the previous list? Why anger? Why bowels of mercy? Yeah, it is. It is. What dispels anger? Compassion. Compassion. Now, to study about compassion and to study about bowels of mercy, you're going to have to come back next Wednesday because we've got 3 minutes to see in this particular series. Well, less than that now, then the bell is rung. But what we're going to learn in this particular section is these are things that we can put into our lives. These are things we can constructively do. And I think the key word of this in verse 12 is put. Maybe the key phrase, put on. And not a one of us in the morning is going to get up out of bed and walk to work or go to work just in what we woke up in, are we? Why do we want to get ready? Because we need to be presentable, don't we? What about our spiritual form? Do we ever need to get ourselves ready spiritually in our lives? I think that's what this section is talking about, and we'll pick up in this particular section. So read through this particular area as we make it through chapter 3 in this particular section, and we'll make it all the way down next week, down to verse 17 for sure. And that'll bring us into an interesting section in this particular area, because in verse 18, he's going to start a familiar section, and he's going to give instructions to family members and workers. And this is one of the particular sections I chose to study these short books, because there's so much about the family in these books. And I think that's something we desperately need. But pick up with me next week in verse 12, and we'll start here, and we'll talk about compassion. So study up on compassion, and we'll see what it means to have that in your life instead of anger. Thank you so much tonight.